We need firearm registration. Requiring firearm registration is a clear infringement on the Second Amendment. The very idea contradicts the concept of a right as something that cannot be easily taken away or restricted. Think of it this way. If the government suddenly required people to register printing presses or subjected churches to mandatory Bible registration, there would be immediate outrage over such a violation of the First Amendment. The same logic applies to the Second Amendment. A right that can be limited by bureaucratic procedures, such as mandatory registration, ceases to be a right and becomes a privilege. And the right to self-defense, which is fundamental to human existence, is not something that should be reduced to a privilege. Why it won't work. Criminals won't comply. One of the most glaring issues with firearm registration is that it primarily affects law-abiding citizens while doing little to impact criminals. Felons who are already prohibited from owning firearms are not required to register their guns because it would violate their Fifth Amendment rights. This was established in the Supreme Court case Haynes versus United States, 1968, where the court ruled that requiring felons to register firearms would amount to self-incrimination. Therefore, the very people who pose the greatest risk to public safety are exempt from registration, leaving law-abiding gun owners as the only ones complying. Ineffectiveness in solving crime. The idea that firearm registration will help solve crimes is flawed. Criminals who operate outside the law are not likely to leave their registered firearms at the scene of a crime. Even if a registered gun were left behind, there is no guarantee it would lead to the perpetrator. Guns can be stolen, passed through multiple hands, or sold on the black market, making it difficult to trace them back to the original owner. In fact, during a 2013 deposition, the Washington, D.C. police chief admitted that she could not recall any specific instance where registration records were used to solve a crime. A massive bureaucratic failure. Countries that have attempted firearm registration have found that it's not only expensive, but also ineffective in reducing crime. Canada, for example, implemented a nationwide gun registration system, which was eventually abandoned due to its high cost and minimal impact. The initial estimated cost of the program was $2 million, but it ballooned to over $1 billion before the government finally scrapped it. The failure of this experiment shows that registration systems are not only a financial burden on taxpayers, but also do not achieve the desired outcome of crime reduction. The risk of confiscation. One of the most significant concerns among gun owners about firearm registration is that it often serves as a precursor to confiscation. History has shown that registration can lead to the government seizing firearms. Countries like Australia and the UK began with registration laws, which eventually facilitated mass confiscations. Once the government has a detailed list of who owns what, confiscation becomes much easier to implement. In the U.S., confiscation schemes have already been attempted at the state level in places like California and New York, where assault weapons were required to be registered, and later confiscation efforts followed. What does registration achieve? The reality is that firearm registration does little to reduce crime or enhance public safety. Criminals who operate outside the law are not going to register their weapons. Meanwhile, law-abiding citizens are burdened with bureaucratic hurdles and potential government overreach. Registration also creates a government database that could be misused for confiscation or other forms of gun control, which is a legitimate concern for many gun owners. Additionally, registration could place gun owners at risk. In places where gun registration lists have been made public, such as New York, criminals have used those lists to target homes for burglaries, knowing where firearms are located. This puts not only gun owners, but also their families in danger. In summary, firearm registration is an infringement on the Second Amendment, ineffective in reducing crime, and a dangerous step toward potential confiscation. It primarily burdens law-abiding citizens while doing little to address the problem of armed criminals. We regulate cars and licensed drivers. A popular argument from the ASDM camp is that we regulate cars and licensed drivers, so why not treat guns the same way? On the surface, it may sound reasonable, but this comparison is fundamentally flawed. Here's why. Cars are not rights, guns are. Driving a car is a privilege, not a constitutional right. The ability to own and carry a firearm, however, is explicitly protected by the Second Amendment. Once you regulate a right, you effectively turn it into a privilege that the government can restrict or revoke. The Founding Fathers didn't enshrine driving in the Constitution, but they did enshrine the right to keep and bear arms precisely because of its fundamental importance to individual liberty and self-defense. Treating gun ownership like driving erodes this right and places it in the hands of government regulators, which is directly contrary to the intention of the Second Amendment. Cars and guns are not comparable. Cars and guns serve fundamentally different purposes. Cars are tools for transportation, and they are heavily regulated in terms of public safety because of their constant use on public roads. Guns, on the other hand, are tools primarily for self-defense, hunting, and sport. Regulating guns the way we regulate cars ignores the fact that they are inherently different in their use and function. Nick Leghorn from The Truth About Guns breaks down the flaws in this comparison. Car dealers don't need to be federally licensed. Gun dealers do. Car dealers don't have to keep meticulous transaction records under penalty of law. Gun dealers do. You don't need to register a car to own it or license yourself to operate it on private property. With guns, certain states require registration just for ownership, regardless of use. Cars can legally be sold across state lines. Selling a gun across state lines without a licensed dealer is a felony. Driver's licenses are recognized across all states. Concealed carry permits are not. You don't have to notify the federal government when you drive your car across state lines, but certain firearms like short-barrel rifles require ATF notification when transported. Cars aren't banned for looking scary, but guns like AR-15s are targeted based on appearance alone. It won't stop criminals. Regulating firearms like cars wouldn't address the core issue of criminal misuse. Criminals do not obtain firearms through legal channels. A federal licensing system would simply create more hoops for law-abiding citizens to jump through, while criminals would continue to obtain guns through black markets, theft, and straw purchases. Just as unlicensed drivers still manage to drive cars illegally, unlicensed individuals would still manage to obtain firearms. In fact, a federal licensing system could create an even larger black market for guns, making the situation worse. Licensing is backdoor registration. Federal licensing schemes for gun owners would be nothing more than backdoor registration. By requiring gun owners to obtain a license from the government, you're effectively creating a list of gun owners that could be used for future restrictions or even confiscation. History has shown that registration often leads to confiscation, as seen in countries like Australia and the UK. In the US, states like California have used registration lists to confiscate certain types of firearms after they were later banned. Inefficiency and lack of impact. The burden of proof lies with those advocating for these regulations to show how they would prevent crime. What specific mass shooting or violent crime would have been prevented by a federal licensing system? Historically, even the most stringent gun control laws haven't significantly reduced violent crime. In fact, cities with strict gun control laws like Chicago and Washington, D.C., continue to have some of the highest rates of gun violence in the country. The failure of these laws to stop crime underscores the reality that criminals do not obey regulations. The federal government has no authority. Finally, the federal government has no constitutional authority to regulate firearms in this manner. The Second Amendment was specifically designed to prevent federal overreach into the rights of citizens to keep and bear arms. Any attempt by the federal government to implement a national gun license would be a gross overreach and a violation of the Constitution. In summary, regulating firearms like cars is not a reasonable or effective approach. Firearms are a constitutionally protected right, not a mere privilege. Criminals will continue to obtain guns illegally regardless of licensing, and such systems risk backdoor registration and eventual confiscation. Additionally, the federal government has no authority to regulate firearms in this way. The Second Amendment is meant to protect citizens from government overreach, not to invite more of it into our lives.